Okay, and so now, without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's event with Stuart Kendall. Stuart, will you join us, please?
Hello. Thank you for that very warm welcome. Extraordinary. I all of that sounds interesting to me, but but here we are, and here we are to talk about William Blake. When we met at the Artaud conference last year, I had no idea that you were the same Stephen Pritchard in the Blake space, and now here we are. So as you said in your introduction, I write probably for the most part about the French philosopher Georges Bataille. And so today I'd like to think about the relationship between Bataille's work and William Blake. Um, so this is Bataille's reading of Blake. I'm calling the talk Infinite Liberty, Georges Bataille reading William Blake in Postwar France. And I'm borrowing the title of this talk from that of a book that was never written. In March 1950, Georges Bataille proposed a book entitled William Blake, or Infinite Liberty, to a Swiss publisher named Pierre Caillet. This book would have included an interpretive essay by Bataille, as well as translations of selected works by Blake. In Bataille's Œuvre Complètes, we can find manuscripts for the essay, some fragments, we can find an outline, we find drafts of these translations. The project, however, remained incomplete, and we can only speculate as to why. But that's not to say that Bataille didn't write about Blake or that Blake vanished from his work. I mentioned this abandoned book mostly as a kind of high watermark or peak of Bataille's interest in Blake, which is, of course, the thing I want to dig into today. Um, just exactly why was Bataille drawn to Blake? What was he looking for in Blake? And what did he find? What did he take from Blake? And then perhaps also we can speculate as to what he gave back. How did Bataille's reading of Blake shape the lasting reception of Blake in France? But my main focus today is really, um, why did Bataille read Blake? What was he doing there? So obviously, what I'm interested in here is in questions of interpretation and inheritance. And I should probably confess right here at the beginning that I'm not all that interested in whether or not Bataille's readings of Blake are accurate or original. Um, I'm more interested in the affinities, the real and imaginary affinities that brought Bataille to Blake, and then how they resonated within his work. Just where did it go? And in thinking about this, I'm following Bataille himself. In his book Guilty, he said, "Nothing is more foreign to me than a personal mode of thought." In other words, originality wasn't his purpose. He also said in Theory of Religion that the foundation of one's thought is the thought of another. That is to say that thought is something that is inherited, borrowed, or passed along, that it's communicated, and that this kind of communication is no direct or simple thing. In his book on Nietzsche, Bataille said each book is also the sum of the misunderstandings that it occasions. Our thoughts, in other words, can go astray. So tracing these wandering thoughts, these moments of recognition and misrecognition or understanding and misunderstanding is going to be the purpose here today. But thinking about that, those peregrinations, and particularly in Bataille's case, we have to also think about the people that Bataille read Blake with. So with whom or through whom did he read Blake and in conversation? And on this point, and directly related to Blake, Bataille's friend Maurice Blanchot said that Blake's life has drawn the gaze of devotees, and his work has offered to many who have recognized themselves in it the mirror of the impossible. So my purpose here today will be to follow Bataille's gaze as far as possible into the mirror of the impossible. But Since here I'm speaking with the William Blake Society, I should probably introduce Georges Bataille. Who was Georges Bataille? He was born in 1897. He died in 1962. He was, in the words of Michel Foucault, one of the most important writers of his century. So that's high praise indeed. Other philosophers like Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, Jean Baudrillard, Julia Kristeva, they all wrote in direct response to Bataille's work. But who exactly was he? Well, he was trained as a medievalist librarian, but he was also a novelist, a cultural critic, and philosopher. He made distinct contributions to many fields, but he was also a very controversial figure, as infamous for his, let's say, divisive conflicts, as well as for his enduring friendships. But he worked as a librarian for most of his professional life at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France for many years, then later in Carpentras and Orléans. Of course, his true legacy lies in the work that he did after hours. Prior to his training as a librarian, he had a religious crisis. He had this longing for faith that was ultimately unconfirmed and abandoned, but that quest for the sacred was part of his orientation. In the 1920s, he moved in Surrealist circles, particularly the orbit of the painter André Masson, who provided illustrations for Bataille's scandalous classic Story of the Eye in 1928. This was the same period in which Bataille became the editor of the journal Document, Journal of Art and Ethnography. His contributions were so virulent, the materialism of his thought was so virulent that he was violently attacked by André Breton in the Second Surrealist Manifesto. In the 1930s, Bataille drifted, and that's his word, along with his generation into political engagement. He published political articles in La Critique Sociale, the journal of the Democratic Socialist Communist Circle, that was edited by the communist Boris Sovereign. So Bataille's writing shifted from a psychoanalytically informed aesthetic criticism towards anthropology and political economy. During this period, he started following Alexander Kojève's course on Hegel's phenomenology of mind. But in the late 1930s, Bataille's political activism took a religious turn. He co-founded the journal Acéphale and an eponymous secret society, as well as the College of Sociology. So these were all communal endeavors galvanized by the active presence of the sacred. The studied objectivity, they studied the sacred objectively, but they also pursued it subjectively, personally through ritual and meditation. So Bataille's tutelary figure in this period of his work was, of course, Nietzsche. Now, World War II brought this form of political activism to an end, and Bataille's writing shifted into a deeper form of meditation and philosophical autobiography. These are all but unclassifiable books that he is perhaps most famous for in some ways. These writings, too, occasioned violent attack, this time by the ascendant existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who called Bataille a new mystic. After the war, Bataille's writings fell into a much more recognizable form. He founded the journal Critique, which is, of course, still being published, as a vehicle for critical writings in sociology, anthropology, literary studies, and political economy. He collected many of these essays into books, including The Cursed Chair, Eroticism, Literature and Evil. He wrote about anthropology and visual culture in books like Lescaut or The Birth of Art and Manet. Bataille at this point is perhaps best known for his notion of expenditure, the assertion that it's not necessity but luxury that presents living matter and mankind with its fundamental problems. The problem for the world, according to Bataille, is not a kind of scarcity that could be solved by rational or functionalist efficient utility, but rather an excess and waste. It's not a problem of too little, but rather one of too much, what is to be done with the fundamental exuberance, the overflowing too muchness of the world and of our lives in it? The problem is a problem, in other words, of energy. The accursed share, Bataille's most extended treatment of this problem, begins with an epigram from William Blake. Now, Bataille tells us that he started reading Blake around 1935. And this claim might be slightly inaccurate. Bataille's familiarity with Blake undoubtedly precedes that date. But just when exactly did he start reading William Blake? Now, it's likely that he started reading Blake in the translation by André Gide that was published in the Nouvelle Revue Française in 1922, or at least that he was aware of Blake through Gide's treatment of Blake. Gide also mentions Blake in an article on Dostoevsky that he published the following month in the same journal. And at this time, Bataille was a follower of the Russian emigre philosopher Lev Shestov, who published in that same journal at that same time. So there's a strong sense that Bataille may have been, or a strong likelihood anyway, that the Bataille may have been influenced by Gide's reading of Blake, which of course affiliates Blake with Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. Now, Bataille might also have come to Blake through his affiliation with the Surrealist group, most notably the Surrealists and fellow travelers who were associated with André Masson in his studio at the 45 Rue Blomet. Bataille didn't officially join the Surrealist group, but his closest friends, Michel Laris and André Masson, were members of the group, lifelong Surrealists. Now, Masson and these writers and intellectuals who gathered at his studio were a bit more intellectually adventurous than the somewhat puritanical writers who followed Breton more closely. The writers of and painters of the Rue Blomet were ones who read Nietzsche, the Marquis de Sade, and Dostoevsky, and all those figures are, of course, shunned by Breton. These figures of Rue Blomet did not shy away from alcohol or intoxicants. They smoked opium in their quest for visionary experiences. Among other remarks about this group, André Masson later wrote, "I don't think anyone else at that time better understood Gerard de Nerval, the prophet and practitioner of marriage of dreams and life, and William Blake, the great officiant of the marriage of heaven and hell." And of course, this is the same moment when Philippe Soupeau and his wife Marie-Louise published their translations of Songs of Innocence and Experience, as well as Soupeau writing an illustrated essay about Blake. Soupeau, of course, had been expelled from the Surrealist group as being too literary, but that wouldn't have bothered the folks at the Rue Blomet. Artaud had also been expelled the same day, and he was great friends with them. So for the Surrealists, Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell was something that they could read alongside Rimbaud's A Season in Hell as the fruit of an inflamed visionary imagination. Either one of these two contexts may have influenced Bataille's reading of Blake. However, there is another more important influence. In April of 1936, this woman, Colette Pénaud, read The Marriage of Heaven and Hell during a trip to Madrid. One proverb of hell marked her very deeply. "Drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead." She took this phrase on as a kind of personal talisman. She quoted it frequently in her own writings. It became very much her watch phrase, if you will. Now, Colette Pénaud is more commonly known under her pseudonym Laure. She had been a former militant communist, and she met Georges Bataille when they were both associated with the Democratic Communist Circle and the journal La Critique Sociale, which she financed. 2 years prior to her encounter with Blake, which is to say back in 1934, she and Bataille had embarked upon an affair that ended Bataille's first marriage and severely damaged Pénaud's relationship with her partner, Boris Sovereign. 2 years after all of that strain, in October 1936, Pénaud left Sovereign for Bataille. She moved in with him. On October 22nd of that month, Bataille borrowed The Marriage of Heaven and Hell from the Bibliothèque Nationale. We have a record of the books that he borrowed. And he kept it until June of the following year. So that month, October 1936, that is when Bataille began to read Blake in earnest, because his lover, Colette Pénaud, was reading Blake in earnest. But this is the moment when Bataille, of course, is also involved, as I said earlier, with Acéphale and the College of Sociology, the period when he was drawn to what he called the monstrous mistake of founding a religion. The journal Acéphale had been created in 1936 as a venue for the defense and reparation, the reclamation of Nietzsche from the Nazis. This journal and secret society sought a religious politics of the death of God. So this is the moment when Bataille discovers Blake. He asks André Masson, who also provided illustrations to Acéphale, if Masson would do a drawing of Pénaud's favorite proverb of hell, drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead. He also projected publishing a volume of translations of Blake's work, illustrated by Masson, to be included and published by Guy Lévis-Mano, the publisher of Acéphale and a series of books. But that project, of course, was ill-fated and nothing came of it. Now, Colette Pénaud, for her part, had tuberculosis. In March of 1938, so less than 2 years later, she was hospitalized. She returned home in July and died there on November 7th, 1938. Bataille, of course, was shattered. He placed a copy of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in her coffin with her. Years later, when André Masson wrote his memoir of Bataille, a short memorial piece, he titled it The Plow of the Cart, in acknowledgement of Pénaud and their relationship. But of course, these are not the only readers of Blake in France in the 1930s. Blake had been having something of a moment, occasioned by an exhibition sponsored by the French-British association called Art and Tourism, devoted to promoting art and intellectual cultural exchange. The exhibition featured watercolors by Turner, prints by Blake, selected by Campbell Dodgson, the keeper of prints and drawings at the British Museum. So this was open at the Bibliothèque Nationale from January 15th to February 15th, 1937, before moving on to the Albertina in Vienna. And of course, Bataille was a librarian at the Bibliothèque Nationale. It's almost impossible to imagine that he would not have seen the exhibition. But he was not alone. During the same period, other people were taking a strong interest in Blake. The journal Message had started a little bit earlier, kind of lost its footing, and then it was taken over by the editor Jean Lescure as a publication devoted to poetry and philosophy, or rather to poetry as philosophy. Each issue included essays, poetry, and criticism exploring themes in this intersection. The first issue, to define the new orientation of the journal, was devoted to William Blake. So there's a presentation piece by Lescure, poems inspired by Blake, essays about Blake and revolution, modern thought, imagination, Blake's graphical work, selection of Blake's poems in French and English. There were French writers and English writers, Herbert Reed, Geoffrey Keynes, the French philosopher and poet Jean Wahl was a professor at the Sorbonne at the time, and he wrote about his engagement with Blake, whose work he had been reading for many years. Now, Wahl is very important in this story. He's a friend of Bataille's. He had published in Acéphale about Nietzsche and the death of God. Jean Wahl also wrote poetry, but he's best known as probably the single most important figure for bringing Søren Kierkegaard's work to the understanding of French intellectuals in the 1930s. So he wrote about Kierkegaard, about Hegel, about existentialist philosophy. He was 10 years older than Bataille, so that makes him almost 20 years older than Jean-Paul Sartre. And he was recognized at the time as one of the most significant philosophers in France. During World War II, Jean Wahl came to the United States and taught at Mount Holyoke College. He returned to France after the war, to a position at the Sorbonne, but he also founded something called the Collège Philosophique, which was a para-academic lecture series where Bataille gave a number of important lectures over the years. He also founded the journal Du Callion, to which Bataille contributed. The point here is that Bataille and Jean Wahl were great friends and collaborators in many different ventures over the years. Now, Jean Wahl wrote the lead article for the second issue of this new orientation of Message, defining its theme. And the article is called Poetry and Metaphysics. And Blake, of course, is a central reference within that. But Jean Wahl wrote other essays on Blake, including an essay for the catalog of the Blake Show at the Galerie René Drouin in Paris in 1947. Bataille quotes from that article in the article that he wrote about Blake. But let's go back to Message for a moment longer. This is the period when Bataille has already started to read Blake in earnest. But in 1939, coincident with the publication of this issue, he went back to the Bibliothèque Nationale and borrowed Blake's Poetry and Prose, the Keynes version, Nonsense Press, for another year. He borrowed it in February 1939 and returned it in April 1940. In June 1939, he borrowed Pierre Berger's translations of the first and second prophetic books, returning that also in June 1940. And of course, the dates here matter to some extent. World War II began in September of 1939, and France was invaded and overrun by the Germans in May and June of 1940. Bataille briefly fled Paris, but it's funny to me to note that he paused his flight long enough to return his library books. Message took flight as well. It stayed a journal of poetry, but it was reborn undercover, underground, as a journal of resistance. Paul Éluard joined Jean Lescure as an animating figure, and it shifted its goals as a journal. Poetry, we should note, was a privileged form for writers of the resistance in its first moments. The manifold meanings of poems often eluded or stymied the censors. So poetry was something that resistance writers could do to spread a message without kind of under the radar. The second issue of this new underground form of Message was published in 1942, and it too included an article about William Blake and the revolt against moral law. Jean Lescure claimed that this was by Herbert Reed, but it's published anonymously. Bataille continued to contribute to other issues of Message. I fantasize that he actually wrote that article, but it's hard to say. Lescure wrote a memoir of the period that he called Poésie et Liberté, and this notion of liberty, of freedom, was the central watchword of the journal at that time. And of course, that is a very Blakean term. Paul Éluard's poem Liberté was written at this time, and it became the single most galvanizing poem of the period, memorized by generations of French school children. But again, there's a resonance with Blake. Before we turn to Bataille's reading of Blake more directly, we should look at one more catalyzing figure, and that is Maurice Blanchot. Bataille and Blanchot had met one another in late 1940 or 1941 or early 41. They recognized their intellectual affinity, and some of that affinity can undoubtedly be found in Blake. When Blanchot published his first collection of literary criticism in 1943, the book is called Faux Pas. The first 6 essays of this collection follow the kind of content itinerary of Bataille's first book, also published by Gallimard that same year, Bataille's book Inner Experience. The topics are Kierkegaard, Meister Eckhart, Hinduism, Marcel Proust, a review of Bataille's book, and of course, William Blake. Blanchot's essay on Blake was a review of the Gide translation of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which had been re-released in a second edition by José Corti in 1942. And this constellation gives us a sense of the sort of philosophical, literary, and religious milieu in which Blanchot and I think Bataille read Blake. And all of this is to the point that I'm trying to get to. Who was Bataille's Blake? Um, Bataille's Blake is someone he read alongside other figures. And I'll say that Bataille's Blake is an interdisciplinary Blake. Bataille's Blake is celebrated by Blanchot, Gide and Suppot, uh, Colette Peynaud and André Masson, Lescure and Jean Walls, who is a poet of resistance and literature, but also philosophy and religion, psychology, problems of the mind and body, of consciousness, of knowledge and imagination, of visionary experience and the sacred. This is a Blake concerned with morality and desire, with the repressive forces of church and state. This is a Blake that is read perhaps less with early English romantic writers than with Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche, with Sade and Rimbaud, with Meister Eckhart, Jacob Boehme, and Paracelsus, among others. These are figures that are referenced in the writers writing about Blake that I've been talking about. So these are the figures that Bataille comes to Blake with or alongside. But he, of course, adds his own interpretive frame as well. For Bataille, he says, if I had to name those English writers who moved me most, they would be John Ford, Emily Bronte, and William Blake. He compares Blake to Lautréamont on several occasions. But most consistently and emphatically, and this is important, Bataille reads Blake alongside the Marquis de Sade and Francisco Goya. The book that Bataille hoped to write about Blake is really a book about these three figures, Blake, Sade, and Goya. Bataille sees them as related but distinct. Goya as a partisan of the French Revolution who etched the ensuing disasters of war. Sade witnessed the horrors of the revolution directly, first from the Bastille and then from the streets of Paris. Sade, of course, wrote the book that was, in Bataille's view, and as a quote, the freest expression of the horror of liberty. And that's the 120 Days of Sodom. So Blake, in his turn, and in Bataille's somewhat surprising estimation, expressed the same doctrines as Sade, and this is the quote, but in mystic terms, less impatient and more assimilable than Sade. Infinite Liberty, Bataille's book, would have brought these three figures together around the problems and promise of the French Revolution. So freedom and its limits, civil society and the festival, energy and understanding. That moment, the 1790s, was very important to Bataille as a period of social decomposition and realignment, a catastrophic explosion of personal and political energy, the ultimate symbol of which, for Bataille, was the guillotine, in particular, as it was put to use in the death of Louis XVI. For Bataille, the Place de la Concorde in Paris, the place where the guillotine had been put to work, marks the absent center, the foundational abyss of modern politics. He linked this to Blake. Blake's divine image, Bataille wrote, was etched as heads were rolling. In light of this, it's not surprising that when Bataille prepared his translations of Blake, that he would include the French Revolution among those translations. This is the list of the draft translations that we have. So French Revolution, Infant Sorrow and Myrtle Shade, Eternity, Auguries of Innocence, All Religions Are One, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, only in part, Visions of Daughters of Albion. Now, it's not clear whether this is the full list of translations that Bataille wanted to include, but this is certainly the ones that we have in draft form. Um, it's likely that he prepared these translations with the collaboration of his second wife, Diane de Cocheby. She had been raised in England and was a fluent English speaker, and he sought translation work for her and for the two of them over the years, in this period. In October 1946, Jean Lescure was hoping to do an anthology of Blake writings, and he offered Diane's services as a translator. But that project failed to materialize. Um, all of that said, you know, Bataille actually did publish some writing about William Blake. It wasn't just a series of hopeful dreams and failed projects. He published two articles about Blake. The first, William Blake or the Truth of Evil, in his journal Critique in September and November 1948. The second, The Theology and Madness of William Blake, also in Critique in March 1949. The longer essay was important enough for him to have included it in his uh, collection of literary criticism, Literature and Evil, published by Gallimard in 1957. And Bataille kind of took the best of both the entire first article and the best bits of the second article and turned them into one long article about Blake. But these are not the only traces of Blake in Bataille's work. You know, it's not just these unpublished scraps and this one published article. Bataille used epigrams from Blake in Inner Experience, Guilty, and The Accursed Chair, as we've said. He also quoted Blake and mentions his work in many other essays and books as well, which is to say that Blake makes this kind of consistent, frequent appearances in Bataille's writing. If we're going to try and understand what Bataille thinks about Blake, we have to read not only the things that he, wrote and published, but also these textual and kind of paratextual references to Blake. Now, we don't have time to do all that today. So what I'm going to do instead is focus in on one main problem, the problem of contraries, and then think about an additional resonance of that problem, and that's what we'll try and do. And maybe in the discussion we could touch on some of the other areas of influence and borrowing. Um, but in terms of this discussion, I'm going to focus on the problem of contraries. I'm focusing on it because the problem of contraries is, of course, perhaps the central problem, um, not just for Bataille, but for many, many thinkers and writers of his generation. The problem of contraries is the problem of dialectical thinking. And the master thinker of dialectics is, of course, Hegel, followed by Hegel, Marx. Thinking about dialectics means thinking about dialectical materialism. It means thinking about masters and slaves, historical materialism, and of course, as it relates to idealism. Thinking about dialectics means thinking about the problems of matter and ideas, the problems of consciousness, knowledge, imagination, and more things besides. This had been a problem that Bataille had been thinking about since at least the late 1920s. And he was looking for ways to think through this problem of dialectical of thinking, not necessarily to rid himself entirely of Hegel, but to find alternatives to Hegelian thinking. And that is also to say to Marxist or communist thinking. Now, to take two examples just very quickly, in Bataille's view, materialism, including historical materialism, had never been materialist enough, since it excluded the utterly formless base matter. In another way, though, rationalist specialized objective science and scientific knowledge had never been adequate in its attempt to account for the persuasive power of myth and religion for individuals. So in relation to this, the problems of the sacred and the profane described by the sociology of religion seem to exist in a non-dialectical tension with one another. And Bataille was trying to solve all these puzzles at once. All this is to say that dialectical thinking in its Hegelian or Marxist forms had not been able to account for the gaps and disparities haunting the margins of its mechanisms. Nevertheless, there was this tremendous promise in that kind of holistic, totalizing thought. The thing that brought Bataille into proximity with the Surrealist group was that very promise. He didn't join, but he described himself as the enemy from within. Andre Breton, in the Second Surrealist Manifesto, said that everything leads us to believe that there's a certain point in the mind where life and death, the real and the imaginary, the past and the future, the communicable and the incommunicable, are no longer perceived in contradiction with one another. Bataille quoted this passage, not fully agreeing with it, but he quoted it and added that this point also includes good and evil, pain and joy. This is the point indicated both by violent literature and the violence of mystical experience. And only this point matters. So finding this way to think through the problem of contraries is what he's trying to do. Now, there's a paradox, of course, in all of this, the search for a dialectical mode of thought that could transcend the limitations of Hegelian, Marxist, or even Christian dialectical thinking. And toward this type of thought, Bataille had been drawn to Nietzsche, who wondered in Human Alto Human how something can arise from its opposites. And of course, to Nietzsche's idea of thinking beyond good and evil. And he'd been drawn to Heraclitus, who recognized that night and day are one. And I believe he was drawn to William Blake. So it's easy to see why he might have been drawn to Blake, to the marriage of heaven and hell, to the contraries of innocence and experience, to Milton, where Blake reveals that contraries are positive. Negation's not a contrary. There's a place where contraries are equally true, the beginning of book 2. For Blake, without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. From these contraries spring what the religious call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active springing from energy. Good is heaven. Evil is hell. So Bataille quotes these lines in his essay on Blake, reprinted in Literature and Evil, insisting that instead of turning away from evil, we should look it boldly in the face. This is Bataille's claim. So my argument here is that Blake provides Bataille with an alternative to Hegelian dialectical thinking, a unified mode of thought that does not collapse contraries into comforting and triumphant, however horrifying, synthesis. Now, Maurice Blanchot, in his review of Gide's translation of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, described Blake's approach pointedly and in language that is similar to Bataille's. Blanchot wrote, William Blake has conceived of a form of synthesis that makes him the adversary anticipated by Hegel and the model of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. He wants to unite contradiction in himself, not to resolve it or surmount it, but to maintain it in its constant tension. Jean Wall had said something very, very similar to this in his essay on poetry and metaphysics. Part of the appeal, I'm arguing, of William Blake to writers and philosophers in France in the 1930s and 40s can be found in this alternate, non-synthetic mode of dialectical thinking, wherein, in Blake's terms, opposition is true friendship. Now, as I've suggested already, Bataille foresaw several indications and applications for this type of non-synthetic dialectical thinking, not only in the realm of politics, but in a wide range of fields and areas of thought, from cosmology to theories of consciousness. It is therefore not surprising that Bataille had used that epigram from Blake, exuberance is beauty, in The Accursed Chair. The Accursed Chair, of course, endeavors to outline a general economy of matter and energy, not only in the universe, but in human society and individual life. Bataille's focus on energy follows Blake, for whom energy is eternal delight. Blake's cosmology proposes a world of pure energy, unfolding in specific, particular rather than general, forms, folding and unfolding, caught up in tension and contradiction. In his notes on Blake, Bataille succinctly brought all these ideas together. For Blake, good and evil are situated like reason. So, reason, ratio, ground, purpose, cause, motive, all those things. They are the organization of life and energy. Energy is the sun, the love that is a furnace, that is terrible. The energy that exists in all people is the poetic genius, evil. This is Bataille's sort of capsule summary in his notes of Blake's thought, but it can also be taken as a summary of Bataille's own thought. This is Bataille staring in the mirror of the impossible. Now, in his notes for this book, Infinite Liberty, Bataille links his Blake book to another abortive effort from the same period, an attempt to write a system of morality. His Blake book, or this Blake Sod Goya book, was in fact another form of this same project, another way of gathering the same material, attempting to parse the same thought, to conceive of a system of morality after the death of God and the good. The project had assumed many forms since the end of World War II for Bataille. It had been a book about the Marquis de Sade and Albert Camus called Camus, Morality and Politics. It had been books about Nietzsche, the death and morality of Nietzsche, the Nietzschean world of Hiroshima. And then finally, as a collection of of essays on literature and religion, on writers who he described as defenders of evil. Sade, Rimbaud, Lautréamont, Stendhal, Proust, Nietzsche, Emily Bronte, Kafka, and of course, Blake. In 1950, Bataille called this book The Sanctity of Evil. Future sanctity will aspire to evil, he had written in 1939 in pages that he would include in his book Guilty. Eventually, Bataille abandoned this attempt to write a systematic treatment of morality or of anything else, right? He's the author of The Unfinished System. But he published several of the essays, including the essay on Blake, in 1957 as Literature and Evil. The book looks like literary criticism on the outside. It's a book, essays on authors, but it's in fact a treatise on morality, on religion and the sacred. The authors under consideration are drawn from this list of defenders of evil. They're, in other words, true poets of the Devil's Party. Now, in his preface to the book, Bataille wrote, I believe that the evil, an acute form of evil, which literature expresses, has a sovereign value for us. And this concept does not exclude morality. On the contrary, it demands a hyper-morality. A rigorous morality results from the complicity in the knowledge of evil, which is the basis of intense communication. Bataille also argues that there is an intimate connection between the transgression of moral law and hypermorality. His effort to conceive of a system of morality beyond God and the good led him beyond moral law, and from morality to hypermorality, from the good to an acute form of evil. The line of this thought begins with energy, but it proceeds through poetic consciousness, what Blake calls poetic genius, out into a world of forms. Bataille believes he is following Blake, and in particular the Blake of all religions are one. He follows Blake beyond the realm of poetry, beyond philosophy, into the domain of religion, the realm of sacred experience. For Bataille, the notion of the poetic genius becomes the basis of a cosmology. He writes, and it's a long quote, but it's the sum of what we're doing here. This identification of man and poetry not only has the power to distinguish between morals and religion, to turn religions into the work of man not of God or the transcendency of reason, but it also opens to poetry the world in which we move. This world cannot be reduced to the things which are both alien to us and enslaved by us. It is not the profane, prosaic, unseductive world of work. Poetry alone, which denies and destroys the limitations of things, can return us to this absence of limitations. In short, the world is given to us when the image we have within us is sacred, because all that is sacred is poetic and all that is poetic is sacred. For religion is nothing but the effect of poetic genius. There's nothing in religion that cannot be found in poetry. There's nothing which does not bind the poet to humanity and humanity to the universe. Put slightly differently, in words that might be more familiar to readers of Blake, this is to say that everything that lives is holy. So Bataille's reading of Blake opens onto this sacred vision, a poetic cosmology. The problems of modernity, the problems of alienated labor and alienated objects, of lifeless things, are resolved in an imaginative or poetic vision in which all things are sacred. Everything that lives is holy. Bataille published these thoughts in his book, Literature and Evil, but they clearly transcend the limits of the literary. They are, if anything, perhaps only literary in some secondary way. They're less about poetry or poetics as a genre of writing or a section in the library than they are about poetry or poetics as a way of life, a transformed and transformative mode of vision. Poetics as perception, in which all things appear as they are, infinite. Now, Bataille proposed his Blake book to Pierre Caillé in March of 1950. He proposed other books to other publishers during the same period as well. Most famously, he proposed collecting the books he had published during the war, Inner Experience, Guilty, and On Nietzsche, under a collective heading, La Somme Éthiologique. We call it in English the Summa Atheologica. He had all this time on his hands because Critique, his journal, was on hiatus from September of 1949 until October 1950. And Bataille was churning, thinking about everything he wanted to say about morality, about religion, about sexuality, about the body and the mind. He was thinking about Blake. He was thinking about Sade, Goya, and Nietzsche, about the sanctity of evil and the search for morality after the death of God. He worked through his thought in notes, drafts, and outlines, arranging and rearranging the essays that he'd already written, along with the notes on topics that he wanted to write about. By the end of that year, 1950, those thoughts had begun to cohere into three main areas of work. A book on politics that he called Sovereignty, a book on Sade and the history of sexuality that he called Eroticism, and a collection of essays on literature and morality, including his essay as a central figure on Blake, Literature and Evil. Blake's place in Bataille's oeuvre hadn't entirely been erased, but it had been restrained, set in a context that reveals very little of the true significance of Blake to Bataille or to his times. Hence my investigation today. Should we have some questions?
Yes, Stuart, if you can stop your screen share and
Oh, yes, of
that'll be
course.
brilliant. And then we would invite everybody to turn their cameras on. That was extraordinary. Again, had great clarity on very wonderfully complex and interconnected issues. I thought that was brilliant. I just
Good.
wanted to, before people rush in with their questions and comments, I was reading your book of Bataille's poetry, and you
Yes.
talk about how he, in a sense, for him, poetry is sacred violence, which is something that really you've referenced towards the end of your speech, towards the end of your piece in some respects. And I just wondered if you could expand on that. It's
Yes. So Bataille contrasts, I think understanding for poetry for Bataille is most easily done by thinking of it in terms of a contrast, right? He contrasts poetic speech with what he might call utilitarian speech or kind of reductive speech. On the one hand, speech has this capacity to be very effective, very direct, very clear, very, let's say, flattened. But on the other hand, language has this capacity for, almost infinite expansion, wherein words can become metaphors, and that is to say that they do violence to that reduced or kind of reductive clarity. The poetic vision that Bataille is thinking of is a vision where meaning and value, um, become infinite. They expand utterly, and he does link that idea with violence. That there's on the one end this kind of flattening, this carefully ordered, reasonable mode of expression and experience, and that's also what we do with tools or things. We reduce them to a single purpose, but at the other extreme, that purpose is infinitely expanded. The possibility of words, but then also of things, for human care and concern, for to take on meaning, all that floods in. So this idea of violence for Bataille goes back to his understanding of the what I call the too muchness of the world, the energy, the seething energy of the world. And I think that that's very much something that he thinks of in Blake.
That's great. I just wanted to be sure I'd understood it. But it's like you sacrifice. Sacrifice is the word here too, isn't it? The mundane
Yes, it is.
shell, so the words can fly free and yeah,
Yes,
all about them.
exactly. And we fly through too. We
Yeah,
fly freely through them. So imagination floods in.
fantastic. Oh, if people would, yeah, Tamsin in the chat, my fellow trustee Tamsin. She says, this is all so interesting. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. When Bataille thought, wrote, and published about Blake, does he perceive him as a thinker, writer, poet, or does he also look at and include in his thought Blake's art and illustration? Does Bataille see the image as a form of commentary and philosophical thought, or only Blake's words? Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, so Blake in the 1940s in France, is primarily recognized as a poet, in particular, particularly for this group of poets. So Bataille is responding almost primarily to the written word in Blake. Now he does go to see those two shows, but you know the way that I think we think of Blake, here in this group is 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 vastly expansive. We are aware of all of Blake's, not just the engravings, watercolors, the illustrated books. But in France in the 1940s, it was the poetry that carried the day.
Fantastic.
Bataille makes a few references to the images, but almost nothing.
Hmm. If people want to use the raise hand function, there's one up already. And it's Diane Kim. Fantastic.
Hi, my name is Dawn. Actually,
Hi.
Dawn is really close to the pronunciation, so I thank you for that. And it was such a wonderful presentation because I just love this kind of archival works where you find who was influenced by Blake and who did that person influence the other. This was a fantastic talk. So I really don't have a lot of questions. Well, I was going to ask whether not Bataille, but his surrealist friends, surrealist, because it's the art movement as well.
Yes.
Did they, as visual artists, had some kind of non-intellectual but artistic affinity with Blake on their own? And also, but my primary question is that so we see this kind of intellectual community that is reading Blake and
Yeah.
influencing each other. I was thinking, especially during this dark times, of our society. I was just like thinking because like I think reading Blake in current society is really it's becoming necessary than ever before. And like I feel like reading Blake in society is really difficult because the society that we are living in is not where contraries are celebrated but actually weaponized. So I was like thinking, what is the meaning of, you know, excavating these kind of like communities that read Blake in to feed their like revolutionary thinking, and how would you like, you know, like what would you like say about reading Blake in this current era? Does that make sense?
It absolutely does make sense. These are, of course, enormous questions of much consequence. So I'm not sure that I
Yeah.
can necessarily do justice to all of it. You know, I'll go back and start with where you began, which was this notion of the archival,
Mm.
which, you know, obviously I love doing that kind of thing too. You know, and as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's, you know, it's not to set Blake or Bataille apart as some sort of, you know, the end of a conversation, you know, to say that Bataille's understanding is the understanding, but rather to take Bataille as a human being that was drawn to, you know, Blake and many other things, because I write quite frequently about Bataille and, you know, other writers, and in this same vein. Yeah, I try to approach them very humbly as a, you know, I'm a human being, obviously, and they are too. They have interests, and you know, what brought them to that? What was the limit of their understanding? What sort of human affinities brought them, and kind of human concerns? What, you know, why did they stick to that page of the book? Those kinds of questions. So yeah, I think that's a thing to say about the task of criticism, maybe. You know, and there's a lot more to say about that, but you know, setting it aside and going back to this question about the surrealists. Um, so surrealists, as we saw, you know, Andre Masson is interested in Blake in ways that the surrealists of the, you know, in speaking of surrealism, we divide it between sort of three main groups. There's the Rue Fontaine, where Breton lived. There's the Rue Blomet, where Masson had his studio, and there's the Rue de Chateau, which is a different group entirely. But the ones interested in Blake were the Masson group. And the thing that someone like Andre Besson is interested in is vision. So Masson is the surrealist who is you know, associated with the automatic painting. You know, this is a fantasy of Breton's, and I'm tying it to Blake because of the energy of line that we see in Blake, and that is very important to Andre Masson. Now, Masson doesn't write about that, but we can see an affinity within that and those, you know, those ideas. So the visionary poet and the visionary artist are something for Masson to see in Blake, and that I think is part of what Bataille, you know, kind of follows him into. Now, whether or not Blake can solve all the problems of the the political era of darkness that we're in right now, I don't know if I can if we can tease all of that out. But this notion of contraries, the way that that these writers in the 1940s turned to Blake as an alternative to totalizing thought, I think is one of the takeaways from this. That as in that marvelous quote from Maurice Blanchot suggests that Blake has this way of thinking contraries together in productive tension. And that is to say that it is not a way of resolving conflicts into a synthesizing, you know, totalizing, and we can also say totalitarian whole. That's not the kind of thinking that we have in William Blake. Blake is not about repression, he's about lifting repression. So Blake has many messages that I think are very much relevant to today's era, as well as styles of thinking, and kind of approach. And that's, again, that's why those thinkers in France in the 1940s turned to Blake. And there's even more to say about that. As I've been thinking about this for some time, I thought it was very, you know, I see our times in those times. But yes, let's what else do we have? I hope that was helpful.
It was absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dawn. That's brilliant. Aaron Dunlap has his hand up. Aaron, if you could put your camera on. Ah, there you are. Wonderful.
Yeah, so yeah, a little comment just from your interaction there, and then a question. The connection with automatic painting, automatic writing is interesting because, of course, Blake said that he was a secretary to his work, that it would often come to him through Jesus or through some other source. The question I had is, I think I would consider Blake a pacifist, sort of politically. Some people might argue with that. But he always made this distinction between mental violence and physical violence. That is, Eden, or the world of spirit, is a place of great violence, activity, contraries, but it was mental fight, right? And he made a big distinction between that and physical fight, and almost always denounced physical expressions of violence. Now, it seems like these French thinkers didn't have, at that time, didn't have Jerusalem or Milton to work with. Do you think they would have agreed with this kind of distinction that Blake makes about the sort of elevation of mental fight? But I don't know enough about how they thought about pacifism or physical violence. But yeah, I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, there's a lot to think about there. I've been talking about people living in the 1940s, and this makes me think about William Blake and his life, and moments where his passions exceeded the purely mental, let's say, when he has engaged in physical actions that had consequence in the world and had consequences for him. So, we can have ideas, but then our things carry us away. Now, that said, I do agree with what you are, like, the distinction that you're making. And and I would say that for these thinkers that I'm looking at here, that they too are interested in sort of finding the alternatives and sort of thinking about the problem of activity and action. Now, at the risk of skipping over, perhaps too much, the kind of the core conflict in philosophy in France in at that moment had to do with the problem of activity, as Hegel defines it, taking action in the world. And what these writers were trying to do was find an alternative to the action of history, negating others, negating other views. And so part of this thinking about Blake and about imagination has to do with this seeking an alternative to political action and political violence. That these writers of the resistance in World War II, but also Bataille before that, right? Bataille with Acéphale was trying to find an alternative to action. So an alternative to the action of resistance. So I'm muddling this up a bit too much, but I'm suggesting that there is this attempt to do away with political action and cultivate something else, some alternative. And where that ultimately goes in French political thinking by the 1960s is into a notion of radical passivity, of the neuter and neutrality that we have in the later thought of Maurice Blanchot. So it's kind of all related, but those terms don't. That idea, that radical passivity, doesn't occur as a phrase until the 1960s. Until after 1958 and the political events in France at that time. But it's there in what Bataille is trying to do, and his turn away from action, his turn towards the sacred, towards religion, towards meditation, towards taking the war on. This is a phrase from him, as a field of violence, and what that I see that as very much in keeping with Blake, the way that Blake tries to think about those kinds of conflicts and bringing them on as a field of imagination and poetic engagement, if that makes sense.
That's very rich. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, there's a comment from Emma Johnson in the chat. She says, I think Blake's mental fight is connected to the idea in the Bible that we battle principalities in the spirit world. Yes, that's Paul. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but thrones, principalities, powers.
Yes.
And there is Emma. She's with us. Brilliant.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just that instantly came to me when you mentioned that. It's a big thing to grapple. Would Blake have thought this? Would he have thought that? Or anybody? But that fight, I feel, for Blake, that fight in the other world was as real to him as we perceive fights in this world, as it were. And in fact, more real, more everything that goes on in this world is just really a reflection of something much bigger, revelatory in the next world. That's just my opinion there.
I think that's wonderful. What was I was reading Bentley's biography earlier today, and he quotes that that passage, and I think to bring it into this to sort of dialogue with Bataille. I was talking just a second ago about this idea of meditation, and that Bataille turns that into a practice of meditation, but I think it's part of Blake's poetic practice, this engagement of poetic imagination as a mode of living in the world, and to have the richness of inner life is that engagement, that knottiness, and that the thickness of our experience, and that's very much what I'm thinking about here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the talk. And the energy that Blake had, that fierce energy that not all writers have and not all people have, I think, for me, still burns bright. So
yes, I think we're all here for it.
Thank you, Emma. That's great. Is there any more
Other thoughts,
questions, comments from anyone? It's a great line, the quotation that's at the beginning of the Vela manuscript that Vela or the Fours Heures that we saw as we have as our introductory and Peace, that manuscript. Yeah, Blake has a great power to use other people's quotations incredibly effectively and selectively.
indeed.
Great. Yeah. Any more thoughts, reflections, memories, dreams?
James, about the selectivity, I did notice that like when you show the list of the works of Blake that he was trying to translate, yeah, I did notice that all of them are very early poems of Blake. So like you did mention Milton at one point, but like I think that's like I don't know, like because like personally, other than like revolutionary thoughts about art, because like I think Blake, while being all those things like poet and like radical thinker, I think he was a very revolutionary figure in arts. Like he redefined what art should be doing.
Yes.
But other than that, I do think there were some signs that his so-called radicality has been decreasing as he grows old. I'm not saying that he turned into like conservative party. That's out of the question. That's not imaginable. But like I do see this like gradual change, especially about his view on women, especially on like his view of like how all the things must like be, they are contraries, the contraries stay, but like they are all connected to be incorporated into the oneness of Jesus Christ or Albion. While his early works are very, very radical and very radical in the political sense. So like that is my dilemma actually, because like while I want to understand Blake as a very, very radical thinker, as he grows old, like again, it's a human, so human beings change. But I was wondering what Bataille, if you know anything about Bataille reading Blake's later works, like very late works, even Jerusalem, which is the most important illuminated books of Blake. So I felt like it would be interesting to like know if there's any attempts to read Blake's later works and also read it like in a radical sense.
In this way.
Yeah.
Yes. So as I mentioned, these are the draft translations that we have, you know, so we can read Bataille's translations of those poems, you know, and that to me suggests that that's certainly where he started, but that's not to say where he would have finished. So he may have included or wanted to include some other works, you know, the later works, but he was drawn to those particular works because they speak to the kind of Blake that that interests him most. So Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Innocence and Experience, you know, a little bit some of the Notebook materials, Auguries of Innocence. The French Revolution piece, I think, is very interesting to read in this kind of context, you know, for a figure like Bataille, who is on his own thinking through the meaning of the French Revolution and thinking about the, you know, the total context of the 1790s. Now, people may be angry with me for saying this, but you know, I don't think the French Revolution is Blake's greatest poem.
No.
Or greatest writing. It's a certain kind of political engagement that Blake, you know, he did a thing in the French Revolution, but it's not a book that he completed as a, you know, in illuminated printing. And he, as you were suggesting, he pivots his style utterly from that kind of direct historical, you know, myth making into a deeper, richer, but also more oblique strategy of engagement that has, you know, a fullness. So Blake's later approach to political writing in Jerusalem, you know, follows from age, you know, perhaps disengagement, you know, having a radical bent to your writing in 1793 is a very dangerous thing to do. So, you know, I think that we see several things there. I can see the obvious appeal of the French Revolution as a piece for Bataille. But also the dangers and limitations of that kind of writing for Blake. So, you know, kind of parsing those two things. Then also, you know, we didn't talk about this at all, but you know, Bataille for readers of Bataille, many people come to Bataille because of his writing in eroticism, you know, sexuality and pornography. You know, for some readers, that's the only Bataille. That's the most important Bataille. And so we can even see that to some extent, this pairing of Blake with the Marquis de Sade that Bataille consistently does, and this emphasis on sexual freedom that we have in Blake. You know, you can, or I can imagine, you know, I can pick up a book by, you know, my Blake book and read it like Bataille would, and that is to say, I would emphasize those, you know, loosing the chains, the freedom of the body. Those are themes, and we see that in his list of poems that he translated. That's already Bataille reading Blake with Sade. But as I mentioned very briefly in the talk, you know, Bataille does not like the Marquis de Sade. Sade is the horror of liberty, whereas Blake is infinite liberty. Blake is the positive freedom, whereas Sade for Bataille, and most people don't recognize this, I don't think. Sade is a very negative type of figure, a very destructive figure, whereas Blake is the positive figure. Now, ultimately, Bataille's writing shifts towards this emphasis on Sade, and there's I think historical reasons for that to do with the publication of Sade's works in France in 1950s. People kept writing to Bataille and saying, "Hey, contribute a preface to this," or that kind of thing. But anyway, it's got to do with these affinities. So there's a lot to say.
Thank you, Dawn. Yeah. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell very much must appeal to the surrealists because of the memorable fancies, because of it. And it's the most transgressive and provocative and playful of Blake's texts, isn't it? Of shorter texts, perhaps. That's interesting in itself. And Visions of the Daughters of Albion, of course, with its appeal to
Yes,
love to be free, has that rallying call to it.
It does. It's very easy to see why Bataille was drawn to Visions of the Daughters of Albion.
Yes, yeah. It has a fantastic climax. I just that was an American publication as well, Stuart, called Transitions. Is that right?
Yes.
And they incorporated bits of the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, or the Proverbs of Hell, in their proclamation. I just came across this the other day and thought of you. This is these Americans in Paris,
Mhm.
somewhere where
great.
they like to be.
That's great company for me. Thank you.
John Reardon, my fellow trustee and marvelous man and comic book creator, is present. So, John, how nice to see you.
You're too kind, Stephen. Thank you. Very simple question, Stuart. For someone like me, and I'm sure like lots of us here who are nuts about Blake but have never read Bataille, where would you recommend we start? Like, if there was a book or an essay or a starting point, where would you recommend we go in?
Well, Bataille is a complicated figure. He published, on a wide range of things in a wide range of styles. So I think the quick answer is, it depends on what you like. If you like to read fiction, then I would read Bataille's book published in English as Blue of Noon, which is a book about the years immediately before the Spanish Civil War in Spain. So it's about politics. It's about revolution. It's the aesthetics and politics. So why people get drawn into that. But it's a novel, so it's a complicated and interesting piece like that. If you like to read more of a kind of an essay, then the Accursed Share or Eroticism, these are essays in sort of political economy, in the organization of society. So it's social philosophy of a certain kind. So that's that kind of writing. My own personal favorite book by Bataille is his book Guilty. And the book Guilty is this kind of philosophical autobiography. It started as journals that he kept during the early days of World War II, but it's extremely rich with philosophical and theological meditation, as well as the kind of climate of war. So it's just extraordinary writing, page by page. And sometimes I read it and I think, oh, this book is just monotonous. But then I realize it's me. I don't have the intensity as a reader to stay with Bataille. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love Blake too, is like just that he keeps going with his vision. And there's just so much there. So that type of writing in Bataille is best found in his book Guilty.
Interesting. I can definitely see that resonance you say at the end there. Yeah, like you have to go and recharge and come back to be up to the job.
Yeah, take small bites
Yeah.
and go back many times. And as you go back, the too muchness of the text will, you'll take different things each time. So, as a reader, I love that experience. So
Great.
good.
Some good starting points. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
I would seriously, I don't get a commission for this, but I would recommend Stuart's biography of Bataille, because again, it has a great clarity and it gives you all sorts of starting points into Bataille's oeuvre. And I thought that's great.
Thanks for the plug.
At the beginning, I mentioned the Acid Horizon podcast because you talk about on Nietzsche there, and I found that quite mind-bending. But again, there's you are super clear, but there's so muchness in it. I have to go back and listen to it again. I'm quite happy to do that, and possibly a third time. But there's a raised hand from Mary Jacob. Mary.
Hi. You mentioned that he didn't actually like Sade, but he did like Blake. So what is the boundary between the two? What would cause someone to have crossed into, I don't know, too much freedom or too much excess?
So the Marquis de Sade, in Bataille's view, the Marquis de Sade is about unleashing the passions, obviously, but it is an unleashing of the passions that doesn't have as we see in the term, respect for others. Like that's part of it is as Bataille summarizes Sade, is saying yes to life, even to the point of death. So there's this horror of that. Can we say yes to life, even to the point of death, and accept our passions, even though they may kill us? And for Bataille, that's a very dark thought, and it's not something to be taken lightly. He has remarks, let's say, about people who claim to love the Marquis de Sade. For him, if you claim to love the Marquis de Sade, then you haven't understood this core message about saying yes to life to the point of death, because as a human being, we should recoil before that to some extent. Now we may embrace ourselves in our fullness, the fullness of our desires, and seek to remove the shackles of church and state that repress us, but to take it to this extreme of destructiveness is what puts Sade in the sort of dark side of things, and Blake into the positive light for Bataille. Blake is about the removal of repression. He's about the cultivation of energy. He's about the love of the body, the love of this world, all those kinds of things, but in a positive light. As Bataille says in a quote that I think I used in this, that Blake is more assimilable than Sade. We can do something with Blake. We can agree with Blake. But for us to truly agree with Sade is, for Bataille, horrifying. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. We have one last question, I think, because we're reaching our time. Our very good friend, Andy Wilson.
Oh, hi. First of all, thanks for the talk, Stuart. It was absolutely fascinating. And I've read quite a few things you've done by or translating whatever, Bataille. I think I read a book, your Epic of Gilgamesh, that you translated.
Marvelous.
Had a wonderful introduction to it as well. But anyway, on Bataille, just to set the scene somewhat, I'm a huge fan of Bataille,
Mhm.
And a huge fan of him as a surrealist, as a wing of an important wing of surrealism as a whole. And also as a Blakean, I have a powerful instinct. One of the themes of my blog is Blake and surrealism, right, and theology and radical politics, right? So I see there's a natural affinity between Blake and surrealism. And yet, in a funny way, Blake's reception among the surrealists is sort of oddly understated, and because he's not mentioned by Breton in the manifestos, for example, and yet to me he's an obvious, like Lewis Carroll to me, is an obvious precursor of surrealism.
Yeah.
It's just bloody obvious, but they didn't. But Breton doesn't say that, for example, and so, and thinking along those lines, I think one of the things one of the reasons that Blake isn't trumpeted quite as loudly as you might have thought he would be among the surrealists is because I think they kind of misunderstand him to some extent. Because Blake is, to me, a deeply Christian thinker, for example, and yet when I first engaged with the sort of radical, modernist art, and I was a young man and I was reading about the Dadaists, I thought it was really cool to read about Arthur Cravan, the boxer,
Yeah.
punching at priests in the street, right? He didn't argue with them, he punched them, right? And I thought it was really radical. And I don't know what
Yeah.
that feels about me or anybody else, but I thought that was terrific. But there is this real anti-clericalism on the radical French, generally across politics as such, and radical art, and of course they massively overlap, and there's perfectly understandable reasons without going into the history, but which
Yeah.
why there's that strong anti-clericalism, but it always reads slightly oddly to the English. I think it's it feels slightly overstated. I'm with you on this, guys, but you're kind of over-egging it. But my point is that makes Blake hard to assimilate unless you assimilate him a little bit crudely by just flipping him into somebody whose marriage of heaven and hell, of good and evil, allows you to flip between good and evil in a quite a non-committal and I would say undialectical way, if you do want to use those terms.
Yeah.
So I just think that there's something in the idea that the anti-clericalism of the Dadaists and the Surrealists had led them to have a slight problem with how they assimilate Blake, and the way they overcome it is to do it in a slightly undialectical, flipping way where white becomes black, black becomes white, and good becomes evil. And you don't have to address any actual religious, spiritual type claims. You can avoid them.
Yes.
That was my thought.
Yeah, what you're talking about is true, and I think very interesting, and it has really colored the reception of figures like Bataille, and is one of the things that I'm trying to kind of correct, if you want to put it that way, by shifting the terms of the debate to some extent. So the kind of anti-clericalism that you're talking about, the surrealists would like spit on priests in the street. So they were, very strong, anti-religiosity in that manner. And that does align with Blake's attempts to get outside the repressive forces of the church. So there is an alignment there. But I think you're right that the surrealists of the Rue Fontaine, the Breton crew, they couldn't get there. How can you be a dissenting Christian? They did not understand this historically or intellectually or anything. How can you have this orientation and um, and still be against the church? Now, so Bataille shifts the terms of the debate in his own career, and I think has been broadly misunderstood in the history of philosophy and intellectual history because people, let's say, undervalue what I would call Bataille's interest in the sacred. Bataille's interested in the active presence of the sacred in community making, and in, sort of the extremes of human experience. That's Bataille's core interest. And for him, the death of God in the sort of Nietzschean sense it is a phenomenon, but that is to say that there is a death of the architectural, edifice, the church, the organizing principles, but it opens us to the experience of the sacred. And it's that quest for the sacred that I think brings Bataille into a different kind of reading with Blake. It's Blake's interested interest in, the embodied sacred and the relationship between these two things. Now, to take this in a completely different direction, but Thomas J.J. Altizer's book on Blake, Blake's Radical Vision, uh, I think misreads Blake in this way, and for these same reasons. Altizer's Blake is a kind of radically embodied Blake. He's a very Christian Blake, and I think that those parts of it are accurate. But he's also a Hegelian Blake, and that's not Bataille's Blake. The Bataille reading of Blake is a non-Hegelian, non-synthetic Blake filled with contradiction and energy that Altizer's Blake does not possess. So it's a complicated question, and I guess I'll wrap it up with that. But I think that Blake is an extremely complicated and interesting figure, and we can see many of these things into it. And part of the reason I keep coming back to figures like this is because of these debates. They're great people to think with, and to think through these problems. So Blake, Bataille, Altizer, all these misunderstandings. I like to take the horse around the track and and see what they were thinking, and that helps me parse the differences between these figures as well.